Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the CoLove First Weds talks. This is the third of our autumn series of talks, the third and final one. And my name is Chris O'Connell, and I work in CoLove. First Weds talks with CoLove. We've been operating these for the best part of 20 years now. And this most recent series has been looking at and coming out of a piece of research that we collaborated with in CoLove and a network of some other organizations with Dr. Barry Cannon from the Maynooth University Department of Sociology. And coming out of that has produced a short report. And so at the end of this evening's talk, if you'd like to stay around, we'll sort of do a soft launch of that report and talk a bit more about what it contains. But the report is sort of given the impetus for and the interactions with Barry that came before the report has given the impetus to this series of talks, which are linked thematically around the idea of sort of struggles for democracy, about democracy as something that we make and remake through struggles and acts of citizenship and acts of global citizenship. And so in previous talks that we've had, going back last month, we had a talk that was focused predominantly on sort of translocal activism and issues around mining in Ireland, North and South, and also in Latin America. And the previous month in October, we highlighted commonalities of struggle here in Ireland between tenants' rights organizations and asylum seekers and undocumented Irish. And so this is the final talk, and we're very happy about that. So I just want to thank our partners and sponsors, so Concern Active, who support this series of talks financially, and also then to our partners in this series, the International Development Department at Maynooth University. And we have this evening our moderator, Dr. Paul O'Keefe, who's an assistant professor in that department. And I'll pass over to Paul now to continue the proceedings. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Chris. Welcome, everyone. I'm delighted to moderate the session tonight. We're going to take I think a bit of a closer look at commonalities and struggle, look at transnational justice issues, global campaigns and democracy in action. So let me introduce the speakers. First of all, we have Robbie Lawler from the European AIDS Treatment Group and co-host of POSVIBE podcast and co-founder of Access to Medicines Ireland. Then we have Nessa Nikasada from the Centre for the Study of Politics in the Department of Sociology at Maynooth University. And finally, we have Attracta Ibreen, Environmental Law Officer of the Irish Environmental Network, Vice President of the European Environmental Bureau, and its Irish board member. So firstly, I'd like the speakers to maybe start by telling us a little bit about themselves, and maybe also telling us what brought them to activism. So Robbie, could you start, please?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for inviting me along tonight. So I'll keep this brief because I can talk on and on and on. Thanks for the introduction. I'm also doing a PhD in DCU looking at HIV treatment activism and hepatitis C treatment activism in Ukraine, which I suppose is timely enough. But I suppose what brought me into activism is I was given a HIV diagnosis when I was 21 back in 2012. Then I started getting involved in HIV activism and trying to overcome stigma for people living with HIV in Ireland. And then when I started working in policy of HIV around the world and started making friends living with HIV around the world, I started hearing how people's families, my friends' families in Uganda and Zimbabwe, just all died of AIDS when we had access to treatment in high-income countries, purely because of the country they were born in, purely because of corporate greed and intellectual property. So I suppose once I started meeting people and hearing all these stories and the inequities, not just around HIV treatment, but diagnostics and how that can impact people's lives. Well, then I came back to Ireland and I knew I had to do something here. So I met up with Dr. Ciara Conlon and Dr. Kieran Harkin, who also had a passion for access to medicines. They co-founded Access to Medicines Ireland, and now we're one of the leading organizations in trying to push Ireland to think more equitably around access to medicines and try basically reforming the intellectual property regime and how we incentivize research and development, take monopolies out of our healthcare, essentially. So yeah, it's a roundabout way, but here I am, and it all got to do with getting an STI essentially. So nice. I always say you can get something happen in your life and turn it into gold, and I hope that's what I've done and continue to do.
Thank you. Thanks, Robbie. Great. So Nessa, how about you?
Sure. Thanks, Robbie, for that. And it's great to be on a panel with yourself and Attracta. Yeah, how I came to activism, I suppose, was through my college days. Initially, it's a great way to become politically active when you're a student, and got involved in internationalist issues. And after that, I went to work with Trócaire and lived in East Africa in Kenya for a number of years. And transformative for me politically, in meeting activists in Kenya who were, working in NGOs, but essentially had come through a sort of underground movement, a struggle against dictatorship, a struggle for multi-party democracy in Kenya. And it really kind of shaped my political outlook. And I suppose I decided to make a change. Instead of working in aid programs, I decided to come home and study political economy issues, and to look at the roles of governments in the global north in how they influence the economies of the global south. So from there, I studied and I worked with a range of other NGOs, and including what's now called Financial Justice Ireland. I focused a lot on solidarity building from Ireland with the global debt movement, both in terms of debt cancellation issues in global south states, but also then focusing on responses to the banking crisis in Ireland as well after the financial crash. And I became really interested in tax issues, listening to activists from the tax justice movement in the global south, talking about their desire to build more sustainable financial systems, revenue raising systems in their countries. So it got me really interested in looking at Ireland's tax model. So I'm currently undertaking PhD studies in Maynooth in the Department of Sociology on Ireland's corporate tax policy. So I've kind of have my head in books these days, and I'm researching rather than being on the front line of activism. So I feel like a bit of an interloper here this evening. But I do think it's a great idea as an activist to take time out to step back and think and read and reflect. So that's kind of the space I'm in at the moment.
Thank you, Nessa. Wow, there's a lot there. And I already have a lot of questions for you. So I'm really looking forward to maybe asking them at the end as well.
Yeah.
Attracta, how about you?
Gosh, being one of the older ones here on the panel, I could talk all night. I suppose I'll be honest, I think it started at my mother's knee and at the dining room table. We were always taught to question. There was always political debate. Nothing was taken for granted. We were encouraged to inquire, to pretend we were Brian Farrell, for those of you who might be old enough to remember 7 Days, to see the gaps in the arguments. But my mum basically, I suppose, very passively sort of gave us an incredible love for the environment. She dragged us to every corner of Ireland. And she didn't ram it down our throats, but she just helped us just love it and really enjoy it. And like many people of my generation, when I left college, there wasn't a hope of getting a job here in Ireland, and I emigrated, but we really always wanted to come home. And when we came home, we saw everything that we had wanted to come home to fast eroding and being compromised. And we started getting involved in various different sort of civil society responses to that, in sort of getting engaged in the planning process as much as anything else, and which is incredibly important in terms of like a first port of call in terms of public participation, for a lot of ordinary people in Ireland. And they don't necessarily consider that activism, but it is. It's your environment is such a huge part from the minute you get up in the morning, and you turn on the tap, whether you have to boil the water, in order to be able to wash your teeth. That's all governed by planning, all of these different types of things, how early you have to get up to beat the traffic to get into town, all of those different types of things. So the But then I had a life-changing accident, and it had a really sort of material impact on the type of work that I used to do. And as sort of part of my rehabilitation and retraining my mind and retraining my ability to be able to speak and engage, I started doing sort of more and more voluntary work, and being sort of slightly strategic and lazy in nature. I decided what was the most effective way to actually take on the stuff that I didn't like, and the law seemed the most effective way to do that. So I became increasingly more focused on the law, and sort of going up sort of the food chain to say, okay, you know, who makes the laws here, who makes the laws that inform those laws, you know, all the way up through sort of, you know, our national parliament to the European Parliament and the EU institutions, and on then to UNECE and UN. So basically they're all the different fora that I'm now engaged in. So my husband puts it down to something much more simple. One meaning of my name is to change, and he said I'm an interfering busybody by name and by nature. So some people born with a silver spoon. I was born with a wooden one.
I love that. I love that. I think all activists are a bit like that. Attractive, you said something really interesting. I thought about seeing the gaps in the arguments. What gaps in what arguments are you seeing at the moment, and what campaigns are you really into? Really trying to, I don't know, change?
Well, sort of, I'm involved in different things at different levels, but at a national level, one of the huge gaps that we're having in an argument is, and in the discussion and debate, is just even the absence of discussion and debate. And it's about a fundamental change to a body many of you will know as An Bord Pleanála, which is the body at the apex of our planning system. You know, appeals from all of our local government effectively go to this body, but it also is the decision making of first instance for major strategic infrastructure developments. And many of you will be aware, you know, of headlines, you know, over recent times, and concerns over the amount of challenges that have, you know, basically of the decisions of the board, you know, and unlawful decisions that the courts have basically struck down, and huge legal fees associated with that. And all sorts of different rhetoric and narrative around people being NIMBYs and holding up development, and people needing housing, and sort of the huge gap in the argument is, well, these are legally flawed decisions. You know, it's not because people don't like the color of the bricks. You know, there's a fundamental problem with the quality of and lawfulness of decision making that's actually happening. And there's been various different reports and investigations now done into this. But, you know, what we're seeing now is a completely inappropriate political response from the government after 5 decades of policy where we have moved from a situation where ministers have control and government of the appointments to the board, or you know, on decisions of this type, that they then established basically in the mid 1970s this independent body, and in 1983 they made it even more independent by involving civil society in the appointments process. And now, at this moment when public confidence has never been more important, and we face huge potential issues in housing and offshore renewable energy, etc., the minister is basically doing a power grab to basically, you know, to take back control, put his people effectively into key positions within the board, completely push civil society out of the process entirely, take total discretion. And all of this is going through the Oireachtas with effectively no Oireachtas scrutiny or debate. And I suppose at a European level, then we're seeing major issues in relation to environmental defenders. And harassment and persecution of environmental defenders. So one of the key things that I've been involved in, is, and these are people who put themselves literally in the firing line, and that's not a term I use lightly. But one of the most important international conventions we have is a Human Rights Convention, the Aarhus Convention, and one of the obligations on that is for the state parties to ensure that environmental defenders are not subject to persecution or harassment. And yet, just in the last 2 years, that convention, the parties did something magnificent in establishing a rapid response mechanism to respond to issues for environmental defenders. But it's really tragic that, you know, within the UNECE groups of countries that's become necessary. So I've been working very closely with the new Special Rapporteur on Environmental Offenders and with colleagues across the UNECE region. And so, you know, from countries, and unfortunately Belarus has just withdrawn, and some of our colleagues in Belarus are facing really, really serious issues there. So and we're seeing issues here at home in Ireland. So it's right across, you know, but very different in scale to some of the types of issues that some of the people will be very conscious of, you know, in Colombia, etc., and places like that. But our special rapporteur is actually Michelle Forst, who was, of course, the former UN special rapporteur on the situation for human rights defenders. So we have extraordinary expertise, and hopefully the positive experience there will actually influence, you know, this Gazo agreement, and similar mechanisms will be. So we're always trying to sort of, you know, create something that will create a ripple effect that will have, you know, much broader and positive effects. But anyway, that's just, you know, some local, some, you know, international sort of focus. So
yeah, I wonder, like this kind of exclusion of civil society from key discussions, is that something you've seen, Robbie, as well in your work? And maybe you want to talk about some of the gaps in the arguments that you see as well.
And the answer is yes, and yes. I couldn't. I could just stop with that, but yeah, no, completely. I suppose the campaign that I've been focused on in terms of gaps is I'll ask this question: are we prepared for the next pandemic?
Okay.
Well, that, like, the answer is a big fat no, unfortunately. So myself, Fernando Sangali from Kenya, and Marisa Portillo from Costa Rica went around to colleges all around Ireland, and we talked at young solicitor conferences. So I think we talked to over around 120, 130 people, young people, about this question. And we gave case studies about HIV, COVID-19, Mpox, monkeypox, and antimicrobial resistance. And on each disease, each pandemic, past and present, we have failed utterly. And what this failure means is the death of millions of people around this world. For example, you know, I could say I'm on my 6th option of HIV treatment. I could probably go on my 7th or 8th if I want to. Fernando said his aunt died of AIDS in 2007 in Kenya because she couldn't get access to treatment. I'm offered my 5th COVID-19 vaccine here in Ireland. Angali got his 3rd because he's here in Dublin studying UCD. His nanny died of COVID because she didn't have access to COVID vaccine when he just got his 3rd here in Dublin. Monkeypox vaccine. Monkeypox has been endemic in Congo and Nigeria for the past 50 years. I have 2 monkeypox vaccines. Not one single vaccine has been sent to Congo or Nigeria. And that's where the majority of deaths are every year. And antimicrobial resistance, 1 million people die every year because of extensive drug resistance to TB, for example. Medicine, as we know, antibiotics, we've all probably taken them here, you know, they're critical for our health infrastructure. But there's so many viruses and bacteria which are becoming critical now in terms of resistance to antibiotics or antiretroviral therapy. So, but there's not enough investment in these. So pharma companies, big pharma, are pulling out of preclinical research and development of new antibiotics. We haven't had a new antibiotic class since the 80s. And yet we expect up to 10 million people dying a year by 2050 if we stay en route. So the question is, how do we incentivize research and development into antibiotics, but how do we make sure that these are available to all? So we go around to these students, showing these gaps in our global health architecture, or these deficits in our global health architecture, but we also give them solutions. And one big one at the moment is the pandemic treaty, which is an ongoing negotiations at the World Health Organization. It will be legally binding, so all 194 members have to sign up. So as we all know here, that's where a lot of the watering down happens, especially from the global north, especially from Ireland. So I got young people from all over Ireland to send emails to their local TDs and to have a day of action with us on December 1st, just gone. So we talked to over 12 TDs, and today I just had a meeting with Taoiseach's office, soon to be Taoiseach, about this. So it's we're making sure that Ireland's voice is one of equity, is one of human rights, is one of dignity, and not to water it down like we done with COVID-19 TRIPS waiver, which would have removed all intellectual property rights on the COVID-19 vaccine. Unfortunately, as we're seeing in the negotiations which are ongoing, that there is already a north-south divide about what we want. they're already trying to move out provisions of tech transfer, meaning if we're putting $10 million of taxpayers' money into the Moderna vaccine, like primarily funded, it was a people's vaccine, it was the taxpayers' money that bought it. Well, then the recipe should be available to manufacturers around the world to make that. The monkeypox vaccine was $2 billion went into the research and development, yet we're given the majority of the intellectual property rights to one pharma company. They don't want to share because they want to optimize profits. So there are key provisions that we have that are pro-public in terms of safeguarding, and that means we can have a quick and rapid response. Unfortunately, because we have a for-profit model when it comes to global health, we have monkeypox endemic in the United States now. Even though we had enough vaccines to vaccinate the world in stockpile, even though we already had the diagnostics and therapeutics, unlike HIV or COVID, we still failed. So now's the time, if we're going to do anything, is to really kind of make change our governance structures to make them more fair and equitable. And so this is an exciting time. It's kind of one of these like once in a generation treaties that we really need to push for. So, but again, is civil society seat at the table, kind of going back to your original question. The pharmaceutical industry have already signed up to the Berlin Declaration. They've already given in what they want to see in the pandemic treaty. And let me tell you, it's not equity. It's they say it's equity, but it's not. So our main ask is to have a seat at the table with Minister Donnelly, or whoever that will be, and the Department of Health and the permanent representative in Geneva. And it's not just one meeting. We want ongoing meetings and consultations, because it is us who work with the communities. It's us who see the deaths all the time, not the profits, and it is us who has the backs of people around this world. So I agree with you. It is difficult, but we have to push, and scream until they listen to us, because otherwise they're just going to listen to pharma here in Ireland.
Okay. And Nessa, what gaps are you seeing as an academic? I hope you're seeing lots.
And lots of connections with the things Robbie is saying there around the profits of multinational corporations and the very valuable intellectual property which a lot of those companies hold. And I suppose my area of study is kind of concerned with the strange juxtaposition, which is that the profitability of multinational companies has really very significantly increased, especially in this century, and maybe, let's say, since the 1990s onwards, where we see, you know, a much bigger share of global profits that is owned by multinational corporations. Yet we see a very significant and consistent decline in effective corporate tax rates of multinational companies. So, I mean, there's a few things going on there in that, you know, there's the question of companies that are doing extremely well at the moment, and there's lots of calls around the world for excess profit taxes and things like that. And then I guess there's also the parallel activity, which is protecting some of those profits, about why these profits are so high and what the connection is with tax. But whatever figure you look at, we're talking about the hundreds of billions, which are the estimates from, you know, the OECD or the IMF or other groups or researchers who estimate the lost tax as a result of corporate tax avoidance strategies. So I'm really interested to learn how those strategies work, you know, how they are put together, and things that Attracta was saying about, you know, the constructed nature of the law is very relevant to this, because it's about how our national legal systems interact with each other. And the big gap, which is global legal tax harmonization on how to tax multinational corporations. So that is, I suppose, that's the other issue, which is, you know, this is a moment now in global tax history when there is intensive work and debate going on about what a global corporate tax regime should look like, what might it look like. And there has been certain agreements made between countries, but plenty of critique, both from researchers, from global South governments as well, who are very concerned about the lack of democracy in the negotiations on those matters of reform. So it's a really important time. These next few years are a really important time to see how the corporate tax issue will be dealt with by governments around the world.
And I think that the kind of common theme that I'm seeing as well is that there's a kind of almost a pushback against having a voice, you know, or people who want to complain. How can they complain? So what do you all think we can do just as like amplify concerns even, or I don't know, increase the power of civil society to be heard? Or is there anything, or should we just all give up and go home? Nessa, what do you think?
Yes, and I mean, I think there is enormous activity from a whole range of quarters who are very engaged with the global reforms on corporate taxation, for example. And I think what we've seen over the years is a growing and united voice from global South governments, from their tax authorities, looking to influence how the rules are set, and critiquing the current proposal that's on the table as a result of the latest agreements for a global minimum tax and a kind of reorganization about how profits are allocated, multinational profits are allocated among countries. It was really interesting in the last few weeks where debate has kind of fallen around the focused on the issue of advocating for the United Nations to be the main forum for tax negotiations. And currently, as many of you will know, it's really an OECD-led process, which is, you know, a small group of comparatively wealthy countries. Though it became what was called the inclusive framework, and there were, in fact, close to 140 countries have signed the recent reform agreements. There were significant departures in that. Ireland refused for its own reasons, but Kenya and and Pakistan also, you know, raised concerns and found that they believed that they could raise more taxes using their own unilateral national measures than signing up to a deal that they felt wasn't just or fair for global South states. So, I mean, I think that's, you know, this is an important debate because tax is complex. International taxation is complex, and this can be a huge barrier to involvement in terms of just having the capacity and the technical expertise available to engage in the debate. So if you look at any of the negotiations, whether they're in Paris at the OECD, whether it's in Brussels, whether it's you know, responding to public consultations by the Irish government here, the vast majority of submissions will be from private sector actors or actors representing multinational companies. And they have a hugely outbalanced amount of expertise in comparison to civil society actors. But I think what you've seen is, even though there is great disagreement over some of the analysis, in terms of framing what's important about the debate, which is why tax is important to states, and that, you know, tax fairness should be part of the consideration. I think civil society organisations have been really crucial, and in Ireland, notably Christian Aid, Financial Justice Ireland, Action Aid, Oxfam, have all, you know, stepped up to the plate on that. And it's a very difficult thing, I think, for them to do, because number one, it's a complicated area and it's easy to make mistakes. And number two, it's a highly, you know, profitable, Ireland's low tax regime is highly profitable for the state. Sure. So kind of putting your hand up and saying, wait a minute, what about the international perspective here? Is a very difficult thing to do. But I think that is what the civil society movement has contributed to the corporate tax debate.
Okay, now I wonder about these like transnational conversations, especially if you're, mean, I know from my own work, working with refugees in Kenya, Jordan, developing countries in general, that it's very, very difficult to ensure some kind of equality in that conversation. It's so easy to veer into tokenism. It's so easy to you know, to assume that maybe your partner country is agreeing with you because they really agree, or do they think you want to hear that? And I wonder, in particular, Robbie, in your work, is that something you've seen as well, or is something that you're aware of, that you have to, with transnational struggles, for example, that we have to ensure that everyone is being heard, rather than, you know, us in the West in particular, who have a very strong voice, and we do like to be heard as well. So how do we ensure that these transnational conversations and common struggles that we all share are equal, or are some way close to being equal?
Mm-hmm. This is super important when we talk about pandemics, okay? So we're in an era where we're expecting more and more pandemics more frequently. So even if we're going to be more selfish, we want everyone to be able to sort out pandemics more and more quickly and equitably, because as we know, we didn't vaccinate those in Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America. We expect more and more variants, which will come back and bite us in Ireland in the ass, essentially, and use it in GDP, more debt, all of this. So, but let me start off with that by answering, like, you know, when there is North-South collaboration and done correctly, magic really happens. So in 2001, South Africa, around 500,000 people were dying a year of AIDS. So they were trying to make import or sell generic HIV treatment, and 37 pharma companies brought the Nelson Mandela government to court. So what we've seen was activist groups, like direct action groups, people like healthcare groups, being on the streets making a lot of noise, as well as treatment action campaign in South Africa. And because they got people on board, the Doha Declaration was formalized in 2001, which basically clarified flexibilities in intellectual property law. And that allows us as activists to try and remove patents during health crisis, for example, okay? So when we do come together, when we do harmonize our messaging, magic can happen. Then we have the TRIPS waiver during the COVID-19 pandemic, okay? And there was really a congealed voice with that as well. However, what we did see is, though, when people in high-income countries started getting vaccines, the momentum went down a lot, while people in lower middle-income countries are really pushing because their urgency was more. We've seen it with the monkeypox, equitable access to monkeypox vaccines as well. So what we have to realize is, although our urgency may change in the global north, we do direct action until we get access to these vaccines. But then actually the urgency changes. Even in Access to Medicines Ireland, we see this shift, and we're like, no, we need to keep up with this because this is affecting other people. So it's constantly keeping that communication alive between our partners, because if it's distant, if it's away from us, well, then it's less on our list as well. So I really do think if we really want the strength in North-South collaboration, we really need to strengthen those ties. And I think even in healthcare, which is the strongest activism in the world, essentially, we have lessened those ties because we've become more insular in terms of access to, or can be, for example, you know, which is important, or Pembro, for example, rather than looking at the structural issues that affect all of us around the world. So yeah, it's just kind of keeping those relationships alive at the moment. That's the part for our movement.
And Attracta, for the global environmental movement, I mean, I think there's a huge awareness, but how do you ensure that, you know, maybe certain voices that normally aren't heard are heard? For example, Indigenous people, or you know, people from marginalized communities in general. How do we amplify as our kind of, or bring them into the common or common activism, let's say? Oh, sorry, I think you're muted. Are you?
Sorry, I beg your pardon. I think it's incredibly important that all voices are heard, and I think Nas's point about, you know, the imbalance of resources is absolutely key. But effectively, you know, we need to think of ourselves like an orchestra. Not everybody needs to play the violins, but we need the violins, we need the bass drums, we need all of the different tones coming. And for me, one of the most powerful campaigns that I've been involved in sort of internationally has been around trade. And that's where we really see the corporate agenda really flex its muscle, you know, across all of the different areas in terms of big pharma interests, you know, the reach regulation, all of those different types of things, you know, the effect on regulatory chill, the effect on regulatory cooperation, tax, you know, regimes, all of these different types of things. And obviously the really chilling effect of investor state dispute settlement mechanisms. But it's really interesting, I suppose, sometimes in terms of being able to reach people here and engage them on something sort of complex, you know, when they're busy sort of running between sort of, you know, trying to get the kids' sandwiches ready and, you know, maybe going for a second job and trying to do all of these different things. Often people actually react most powerfully to the stories that impact people who are much more disadvantaged than they are. It can, that emotional reach can actually be much more powerful. So it's incredibly important that we understand the effects of the decisions that we take here. You know, even planning decisions around factories, you know, or big intensive agriculture, etc., and the effect that that has, not just here in Ireland in terms of, you know, impacts on our waterways, etc., but the fact that soy is coming from, you know, rainforest that is being deforested, you know, and people, indigenous peoples displaced. Sometimes that sort of, that end of the story actually can be much more powerful and resonate with people and be much more effective in mobilizing. And I think, you know, in terms of the ability to reach, I think that there is an issue, particularly in getting that balance right between climate and biodiversity, because there is that sort of imperative, and big business is now seeing, you know, climate as being the next money-making machine. You know, big fossil fuel companies are now backing that. They don't care whether it's cupcakes, you know, cows, or, you know, wind farms, so long as it makes money, or coal, you know, they will go after it. So it's the same actors, just in different guises, but they pull the strings very carefully across a whole agenda in terms of participatory rights, access to justice rights, information rights, and they're fundamental tools that we use in the environmental space. So we can bring a lot of knowledge around really powerful tools and really powerful elements within the EU environmental acquis, which we can use to actually, and groups, you know, like Client Earth advocate lawyers, you know, have been incredibly powerful in terms of some of the challenges that they've brought. And indeed groups like Antashka here and Friends of the Irish Environment, really powerful activism that has massive ramifications in terms of legal effect, legal consequences. But there's a huge pushback against those participatory rights, those access to justice rights. And we'll see that here in Ireland just after Christmas. We know it's coming. Big business is basically calling the shots. It's basically demanding that government curtail people's rights to challenge and hold public authorities to account. So it is an ongoing battle, and the cuter we get, the stronger and the more active their lobbying gets. So these types of debates are really important because, you know, not all of us can play the violins, but we have the NASAs of this world that have the expertise in tax. We have Robbie that has the expertise in health. You know, I have some expertise in environmental issues, and we need to pull together to be able to sing all of those notes and to be able to basically resonate with people and the messages that are going to turn them on, so that they will engage with their politicians, because ultimately politicians care about one thing, most of them, not all of them, but most of them, and that's just being re-elected. So you have to find the message that will get to their electorate, that will mobilize people to actually say, we're not going to vote for you, enough is enough. Because that's what it's all about. That's the only thing that's going to change.
Yeah, it's amazing what the PR merchants and marketeers can come up with, you know, like put a bio in front of something and it's all okay. But Nessa, how do we stay one step ahead of the PR merchants and marketeers and ensure that those politicians, those majority of politicians, get re-elected for the right reasons, not the wrong ones?
How to stay ahead? Well, I suppose building on the kind of earlier question around solidarity, I think, you know, strengthening those connections between people who are concerned about whether it's, you know, corporate tax, or whether it's access to medicines or climate and environment or biodiversity or whatever. Those kind of global solidarities are really important. And I think, you know, Robbie and Attracta have touched on a lot of the pitfalls there. Like, I think, you know, the aid model is very problematic in building those relationships. So I suppose from my experience in the global debt movement, a lot of those difficulties were overcome because they were frankly engaged with by activists together in the global north and south, on, you know, their political positions and their process around strategy. So that's much easier to do, though, if you're working on the same things, and if you're doing the same things. So, you know, that can sort of make it a flatter arrangement of relationships rather than a hierarchical one. So I suppose that's the first thing. And then I think the second thing is, as Attracta has highlighted, is that there are lots of different skills within global movements. And, you know, one of those things I think that we've gotten a lot better at on kind of financial justice work is accessing expertise where it is available. Activists are great at, you know, knowing what they don't know is kind of how we used to phrase it, and, you know, building alliances in order to overcome those. So, I mean, one of the examples I can think of from previous activism was around the time of the financial crash, and we formed the Anglo Not Our Debt campaign out of Financial Justice Ireland, which was campaigning against, if anyone can remember, those Anglo-Irish Bank promissory notes all those years ago.
How could we forget?
You know, that was another very complex issue to understand what was happening with that part of the socialized bank debt. So we formed common collaborations with, you know, the trade union movement, with the community grassroots movement in Ireland, and the global justice NGOs that were used to thinking about sovereign debt. So that was a really unusual coming together of different people who had the same concern, but didn't necessarily either have the support or the expertise to do it by themselves. So I think those kinds of solidarities are really helpful. And I think, you know, they can then be sustained because, you know, lots of those activists that I met in the Anglo Not Our Debt campaign are now active in housing justice, you know, and other forms of campaigning that they're doing together since then, you know.
And I'm sure they were incensed by the banker bonuses in the news over the last few weeks or few days. And I hope they'll be banging some drums on that too. Robbie, what about amplifying the voices that you work with and making sure things aren't forgotten or pushed under the rug by the marketeers from the medical or the pharmaceutical industry?
Yeah, well, we're in Ireland now, so I think nearly all the big pharma are here because of our tax reasons, as we know. And, you know, they do have huge vertical power. The vertical power because the pharma are the ones who basically pump all the money into patient groups, HIV groups around the world, cystic fibrosis groups, and we wouldn't exist. And we do great work with that money, but that means we don't really want to say boo to them, right? They help with political campaigns. They write to TDs saying how many people work in pharma in their constituency when they're brought in. And we're always held to ransom because of that. They have huge political lobbying power. We know that that's actually the industry that one of the biggest industries that lobby the most, or put more money into lobbying in the US and in Ireland. So it really is difficult. There's an old adage in the access to medicines movement that every one time that we lobby the governments, they're lobbied 1,000 times. But, you know, I think it was made, the point was made earlier by Attracta that, you know, they do want to be re-elected, and they do. And once they know that actual equity does matter to their constituents, well, then it's on their agenda, it's on their political agenda. And so it's up to us as civil society to make sure that people understand the inequities. And I think, I can't remember which one was like through the power of story, to say that actual, that's what changed hearts and minds. And I think the people in Ireland really respond well to story and storytelling, and we see it time and time again. Again, we just have to think of creative ways to get those stories out there, but not only share the stories, we really have to be solution based. I think we lose that quite often, actually. I know people, and you tell them all what's wrong with the world in terms of tax, in terms of lobbying power, whether it's healthcare, and they shut down because they're, or the climate crisis, because they're like, there's just too much. What can I do? What can I do? And when I went around to students, I literally wrote out a template, and I was like, what's your constituency? I sent them all the names of their local TDs, and I was like, all you have to do is copy, paste, maybe personalize it and send it on. You have to put it on the solutions on people's laps, help to bring them there, and then you'll get the more engaged ones on your days of action. But we should keep trying doing it in new and novel ways and be creative, and never forget direct action. We have to start getting direct action. When I'm talking to the leaders of the European Public Health Alliance, they say in health, we're so sick of advocates. We need activists, because that's all that changes things. That's really all that changes things. Doing things behind closed doors is important, and having civil society. Well, unless we're banging pots, we need both. We need both. Unfortunately, I don't think we're doing both in all the big ones. I think climate change is quite good. Don't get me, the climate crisis and ecological crisis, and we have a bit to do, and especially in health. Well, I think we need to go in healthcare and talking about back to our origins, back to those days of direct action. And I think because we got too close to policymakers, we're very fearful of messing up with those relationships. And I actually say by getting too close, we're actually losing out on our power a lot of the time. So I'm just thinking, how can we balance that power? Because unfortunately, we're losing. We are losing. So I think we need to go back to basics, be creative, and really think as a movement, as a collective movement. I loved what you attracted about us being a symphony of make this world a better place, because I think we're too siloed, and when there's so much commonalities in the structures that we need to change. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I do think it's kind of a call to action for all of us in civil society organizations.
Yeah, no, it does, absolutely. I also wonder really much about like our fixation with datification of everything and numbers and this, that, and the other. And unless, I mean, as a tractor, you were saying about you know, bringing kind of the emotion forward and giving maybe illustrating what you're trying to say with real life examples. Is that something that you think we've maybe lost a little bit in activism, and that's maybe something we need to get back to, particularly I suppose in the environmental causes?
Yeah, I couldn't agree with Robbie more. I'm thinking about electing him.
Okay.
Because I think his point there about sort of that balance between advocacy and activism is absolutely key. I think it sits politicians right down to the ground to take us into quiet rooms and talk us to death. And a lot of people feel that they've done something if they've said something, and that's not necessarily the case. And, you know, I think there's also a danger that you think you've done something if you tweet it. You know, the Grey Brigade really showed us, you know, what it is. And, you know, the farmers are absolutely great. You know, you know, stopping the streets in Dublin is what we need to be doing on lots of these issues. And I think, you know, it's for me, and I'm going to get emotional now, so forgive me, but it's really significant that this debate has actually come this week, because this very week, you know, in terms of this sort of week in December last year, I was on a Friday afternoon about 2:30, unusually had finished, and I mean very unusually had finished. I was going to have to work over the weekend, but I decided, okay, I can take a break now. I can, you know, go off, do the shopping for the weekend and whatever, and I work on Saturday and Sunday. And I decided I'd just check the Oireachtas schedule for what is now a traditional planning bill disaster, where they rush something through and guillotine debates and do something absolutely awful. But I stumbled across a motion for Tuesday the 15th, which was the motion to ratify CETA, the Canadian EU trade agreement. And it was absolute fluke. You know, it was between this and that I could have just got up from my desk and wouldn't have seen that motion. And I can still feel my stomach flip. I was on foot of a 55-minute debate. And I had heard about CETA back in 2015. And I remember smiling when I heard about it, because I knew that the Irish Constitution was going to play a role. But we had to wait for various different judgments and various different things to be clarified at EU level to show that it wasn't a duty of our EU membership, and therefore our Constitution had its full voice. And I remember I had my first law conference, or no, my second big law conference on it, and sort of back in 2016, and highlighted the constitutional points then. But literally my stomach, I can still feel it flip. And I remember thinking, what in the name of God I'm going to do? And I just reached for my phone and I started ringing and I started emailing. And I reached out to the CoLoV network in particular, who had brought people together to share information. And they brought people that I'd never met before, like, in trade unions and, in food networks and farming, in health and, in all sorts of different spheres of Irish society. And basically, some people answered, some people didn't. But by Saturday morning, I knew that we needed something. And I just set up a Zoom meeting, and the amount of people that came. And by lunchtime on Monday, I'd reached out over the weekend. I'd picked up the phone and I'd rung the European trade networks that I work with all of the time. And, by 3 o'clock on Monday, we had over 100 major organizations, international and European organizations, sign up calling on the Irish government to defer that vote. Now, they deferred the vote. Did they do it because of the pressure and the mobilization of civil society? In all honesty, I don't believe they did. I think they did it in fairness, and great kudos to Deputy Nasa Hurrigan and Deputy Patrick Costello, who basically said that they would not support the vote. But I think civil society's voice and mobilization helped Nasa and Patrick, stand in the gap. And I think that's really important, because politicians do need support when they want to do the right thing. They need to have the courage of their convictions. And everybody who answered the call, not everybody could, but we work like a relay race. And that's really important, because everybody needs to take a breather. Somebody's going to get sick, whatever. But we need to sort of keep the network. And that's one of the great things that CoLoV does, in fairness. It's that gentle nurturing. I call it the guardian angel, literally, in relation to an awful lot of these debates and contacts. And basically, then, following that, we had some levels of Oireachtas scrutiny. And again, that sort of network reached out, and we got experts. And the internet is a godsend to low resource, because you can reach people that you would never dream. You can send people, and academics are so generous with their time and their expertise. Never be afraid to ask for help. Never be afraid to ask for help. And, I remember in a moment of incredible, overwhelming sort of just despair, looking up, I was at a conference in Germany, and I looked up at Professor Dr. Ludwig Kramer, who we refer to as the grandfather of EU environmental law. And he's a huge, big, chitonic gentleman. I'm 5'2", and I was in my flats. And I looked up and I said to him, Ludwig, what are we going to do? And he just bent down and he looked down at me and he said, you must fight harder. And that's it. We cannot fail. We cannot fail. What is at stake is too high. So on those Friday afternoons, when you see something, pick that up, start typing. Some people will come.
Yeah, I think that maintaining that momentum that you were speaking about, Attracta, it's really key. And how do we do this on like a global level? I mean, in particular, where some issue may seem very remote, or maybe your involvement in that issue might seem very inaccessible. Like, what can I do from here? It doesn't necessarily affect me personally, but I still care. How do you get people to actually get off their bums and do something then? Because it's very easy to say, oh, okay, well, good luck with that. I support you, but.
What goes around comes around. There's been loads of things that I've helped people with that have been very removed and very remote from me. But then when I pick up the phone or when I email them, they will help me. It's like karma. But also, it's very, when you actually really look at a lot of the types of things that we're talking about, the level of connectedness is huge. The corporate agenda, it's like, you know, and don't get me wrong, I know we're a small open economy, we need trade, and I'd be the first to say that, but what we need is sustainable trade. But basically the connections are much more profound and much more interlinked than once you start to examine things. You find it very hard to actually identify something that actually doesn't have significance or effect for you when you actually think about it properly. But most people don't have the time or the capacity, or you know, literally practical capacity to sort of do that. But you know, so storytelling, I think, is absolutely key. But also networks, you know, just establishing and maintaining networks and respecting each other, and knowing the fact that, you know, people in a lot of these instances are doing what they're doing in a voluntary capacity. And you really need to recognize that and value that in a very different way. And that could be really frustrating, particularly if you're like, and I recognize that particularly because I worked a lot as a volunteer in this space, and now I'm sort of professionally involved in it. But I think you do have to recognize that there are different levels of demand, different ways of working, and respect that. But but you know, the internet and making people gently aware before and in the lead up to things, because you can't just spring things on people, but very often things are sprung on us. And that is the real problem. Because, you know, if something like the trade deals and something like CETA, that's been bubbling around for ages, like years, and people get fatigued, you know, even when they know it's relevant for them. You know, fatigue is a real issue, and it's one thing that I think the corporate lobby and politicians are particularly cute at exploiting.
Is fatigue from, I don't know, global tax justice an issue, Nessa? Or are people, I mean, this affects us all in our pockets. So
yeah, I don't think so. I think people are really, really curious about how corporate tax avoidance happens. And I think generally in activism, anything to do with our very financialized and globalized society, I think people really want to untangle those complexities. And sometimes that's a barrier to activism if they feel that, you know, that they simply don't understand. And I mean, we saw with the financial crisis, our own parliamentary representatives, our own governments didn't know what was going wrong or the extent of seriousness of what was about to happen. So I think Attracta's right in that people don't like things being sprung on them as activists either, though we have to, in activism that happens where you need rapid responses, but that can work very well when you've established and embedded long-term working relationships with people. But I suppose I'm kind of old-fashioned about these things. I think social movements happen when people meet and talk together and learn together and work out a learning process about a complex thing that they have concerns around, and that is the process, and that is what social movement building is. And that's maybe different from, you know, the sort of trend that we've seen, you know, over, well, maybe the last 10 or 15 years of more, you know, clicktivism and all these things that Attracta was saying of if you've said something, if you've met someone, if you tweeted something. Whereas really, you know, social movement building has always been about working things out together, you know, in small meetings, in big meetings, in those messy ways. But it's about knowing each other and knowing, you know, you have each other's backs, that you can ask questions, that you'll figure it out, that you'll find the information that you need, that you'll challenge each other, critique, disagree. Because also our activism has to be credible. And it's really important that we're not anti-intellectual, especially in the current environment. And, you know, I think the activist movements that last are very reflective movements. And, you know, I think that hasn't changed. So, you know, storytelling about the problem, I think, comes through the process, and the stuff you maybe go public with and try to be in a mobilizing kind of pace, it can be about storytelling, but it mightn't be. It might be key facts about a complicated issue, but the point is that you've decided together, as opposed to, you know, making up a narrative in a very disconnected way from a professionalized NGO or whatever. And I think that can be useful to a degree, but it's not the same as the activity of social movement building.
And this collectivism, I wonder, was that a big issue, Robbie, in during the pandemic? I guess it was, but we were all locked away. How could we even come together?
Yeah, activism over Zoom. Who would have thought it? We had Zoom fatigue, we clicking fatigue, we had everything. I'd like to just add on your point there, Nessa, because it's something that I feel very strongly about too. It's I feel with this professionalization of activism, it has fed into our social movements quite a lot, and we become so immobilized by the bureaucracy that we spend so much time dotting our I's and crossing the T's that we actually get nothing done. The great thing about ACT UP and why they work so well, and even ACT UP Dublin, how we got free HIV preventative drug in this country, and we fought time and hard, is because we had subgroups, and we self-educated. We had some experts in the healthcare field, and we just went out and done it. We just went out and done it because we knew it was the urgency. We've never had higher HIV rates in this country. We knew that there was a need for it. We knew there was a want for it, and we knew it was there in cities all over the world, and countries around the world, but not Ireland. So we just got up and we locked ourselves in the Department of Health, and it's like, we're not leaving until we meet Simon Harris. We're not leaving. And we're like, all right, fine, arrest us. But we knew exactly what to say once we got in there. Now, we weren't experts on like SPCs and of Gilead and trying to evergreening the extension of patent extension of Truvada, for example. But I just think we need to fight. COVID-19 was difficult, don't get me wrong. However, politicians were also at home. They were also in lockdown, so they were also tied to their laptops. So we did have good access, I have to say. And again, it really helped with the global movement, because next thing you know, we're Zooming with people all across the world, which we didn't do previously. I actually think it kind of added another dimension into transnational activism that we haven't really quantified yet. With the COVID-19 TRIPS waiver, it was some of the best global mobilization. Now, we didn't get there. We didn't quite get there to World Trade Organization, but the pandemic treaty is coming out of the failures of the COVID-19 pandemic. So although, yes, a lot of collectivism, equity was on the mind of everyone, actually, around the world. I think they had more of an idea around inequities around the world, thanks to global mobilization. So yes, and can I just say, I don't want to give the keyboard activists a bad rep either, because we got meetings with Simon Harris because we got the whole queer community to write to Simon Harris, constantly saying every 18 hours, one new person got a HIV diagnosis, what are you doing with it? We hounded him so much on Twitter that he couldn't ignore it. We put it on the agenda, Leo Varker as well. So I do think there's a time and place, just like you were saying with Nessa Horgan and Patrick Costello, just saying, look, there's huge movement online. It kind of gives them a back. So there is a place for collectivism, but it shouldn't just stop there. Also.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. And don't get me wrong. I just think sometimes people end up just talking among themselves, and it's very easy just to ignore, as a politician, it's very just easy to ignore the same set of people. But I've made incredible connections, through Twitter and things like that, and over email. So I completely agree with you. But I think it's important, for other politicians who've been fighting for issues like, Lynn Boylan and Alice Mary Higgins and, people like that, and Breach Smith and Richard Boyd Barrett and a whole range of other people, that they saw all of that, and it gave them all validity, and encouragement to sort of, rise up. And I think there's a visibility with social media, and there's an ease and a facility that does give politicians, a second wind, and God love them, they do need it, particularly with this government, because the power of numbers is really extraordinary in terms of, and I don't think people actually realize how draconian and how problematic the agenda that has been driven by this government, particularly in the environmental sphere, in terms of just the rolling back of participatory rights, the intention to roll back on access to justice, really, really problematic stuff being driven on the back of climate that has huge implications for societies and for biodiversity. And the extent to which, Oireachtas scrutiny and our democracy basically is really being compromised. There's lip service being paid to Oireachtas scrutiny over a whole range of issues, everything that we've talked about here tonight, with the guillotining of debates and such like. And it's really time that, and I think Robbie's absolutely right, there is a need for much more activism, a much more proactive, visible response to sort of say, no, enough is enough, down with that sort of thing. Like, literally, there is a real problem in terms of the compromise that we are being told, in a very sort of grown up, sort of condescending way, that, they know better than us and that this is good for us. And, really, we're silly people. It's hugely problematic. And apathy and that feeling of overwhelming is something that they rely on. And we really have to fight back against that, because all too soon it will be all too late.
Okay. Now, before we move to the question section, just if there's any one issue that we haven't spoken about tonight that all of you would like to, speak about, just one thing you'd like to maybe bring to our attention, that'd be great. Give people the time to come up with questions, send them on to Julia, or you can send them on to me as well if you want, and then we'll come to that in a moment. So maybe Nessa, let's start with you. Is there any one thing that you'd like to bring to everyone's attention that maybe we're not all thinking about and we should be?
Yeah, I suppose it's a really important time in the global tax debate. And I think there was a sense maybe in Ireland and maybe in other richer countries that the global tax reform is over. There's been at least an agreement among a lot of states to introduce a minimum corporate tax rate of 15%, which is still not, it's not clear whether it'll actually happen. And there's also been an agreement to change the rules for how part of corporate profits of the largest corporations will be taxed. So I think there's a sense that the issue is maybe done, but we know from research that actually shifting of profits by corporations is still happening. There's still a lot of profits that are being put into tax havens. It may be that these reforms it would have been worse without them, that they had a kind of stabilizing effect, but I don't think they have solved the problem. So the battle is still going on, and African governments are the latest to speak up and asked to empower the United Nations to increase its tax policy-making capacity. And that was a significant vote at the United Nations, where African countries and developing countries stood together and won a resolution in the face of a lot of disagreement from other states. So I would say that the next few years are going to be, they're going to be very decisive, especially for global South states, in how they're treated in relation to corporate tax policy. Yeah.
Thank you. And Robbie? One thing we need to be thinking about?
Not to harp too much on about the pandemic treaty, but I suppose my campaign at the moment. So as I said, I went around universities all over Ireland and conferences. But we gave each student kind of this template email to send to the local TD. So tomorrow I'm going to be sending it to Covlab to send to a mailing list or to everyone who's here. So please just take the time just to either personalize it a little bit to find your local TDs and to send it on. The more that pandemic treaty is on the tongues of your local TDs or the ministers in your local area, it's usually important for the campaign. If you want to talk further about how you can take part in this very important campaign, please get in touch as well, because It's legally binding. It's super important. The real negotiations are happening next year. They're ongoing now, but next year is really going to be the intensive one. So it's going to be a long-term campaign, but it's one really worth pursuing as well. So if I can plug just that and the work that's being done to try and make it a more equitable world.
Thank you. And Attracta.
Oh gosh, one. I'm going to cheat. I'm not going to give you one. I'm going to talk about countering the pincer group movement that is just happening before our eyes, because there's a move to basically compromise the decision makers, and that's basically the coup. There's an effective coup of On Board Pleanála, and that body has profound implications. If you're concerned, you're watching tonight, and you're concerned about climate, if you're concerned about nature, if you're concerned about attracting big pharma and the way that it can operate when it comes in here, and how attractive a regime it is for Ireland, all of those different types of decisions. Basically, On Board Pleanála is absolutely key. And what they're doing now before Christmas is they're going to compromise the decision makers. So basically, they will be in the hands of government, and we know who government is in the hands of. And then after Christmas, they will come for our access to justice rights, our ability to hold the decision makers to account for the lawfulness of their decisions. And if they do that in the context of environmental decision making in our house, they will not stop there, because we have unique and very special rights in the environmental space consequent on the Aarhus Convention. And that should be something that is being rolled out across other areas. But instead, what they've done is they're now trying to entrench and encroach upon those rights. So fight for them like hell, push back like hell on those, respond to our calls. And I'll try and send information to Commonalities in the next few days. But literally, I'm one resource trying to manage amendments, and proposals on amendments to TDs, and trying to get information out to media, and trying to get the media to actually pick up on this. So show interest in this, because show pushback on the corporate agenda is absolutely key. And then the other big thing to think about, I think, in the new year will be to push back on the Energy Charter Treaty. It's an absolutely key and fundamental treaty. We've struck a really significant blow. I think a lot of people don't fully appreciate the significance of the blow that's been hit with CETA, but now we need to move in the Energy Charter Treaty, particularly in Ireland, given the massive implications for offshore renewable energy. But we need to dismantle that architecture whereby effectively governments are subject to regulatory chill and delay and don't act in a progressive and in a way which is in the interests of civil society and the environment on this planet across a whole range of things, because of the types of mechanisms that we see in agreements like the Energy Charter Treaty. So basically push back on the control and that agenda. Don't accept it. This is literally the next couple of months are going to be absolutely critical. Because otherwise, if you can't go to court and you can't basically call a government to account for unlawful decision making, how do you think the direction of travel is going to go on the quality and the lawfulness of decisions if they know you can't get them?
Exactly.
Down
Okay.
the floor.
Thank you very much. Okay, now, so we have some questions. The first is from Teazan Kelly, and Teazan would like to know, what about the role of formal primary and secondary school education in promoting democracy and activism? Who'd like to take that? So how can primary and secondary schools, maybe, or primary secondary education promote democracy and activism?
Yeah, I'm really interested in this, and I think primary and secondary school education has a really strong role in developing critical thinking among our young people. And we can see it's there. We can see the Fridays for Futures demonstrators 4 years in, still turning up at the Dáil. But, that is spontaneous and initiated by those individual activists rather than initiated from the education system. So, I mean, in sort of global education and development education work, it's well acknowledged that really has to begin at primary school level for children, at the level of attitudes and understandings of each other and our rights and responsibilities towards each other. So I think that's really important in primary school education. And in second level, in our secondary schools, there has been, there was always a bit of space in transition year education for students to kind of break loose a bit from the workload of the curriculum. But that was really the only space. And now, at least with Politics and Society and myself, and I know Barry Cannon, who wrote the report being launched tonight, also lectures in politics, having politics students in Maynooth University who have taken this subject, it means that they're already politically engaged and they're ready for debate, no matter what their political perspective is or set of ideas are. But I think that subject isn't offered in all schools. I think it's still quite small scale, though others may have more information on that. But, we have to start young with the idea of international education and thinking internationally and thinking critically and philosophically as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. And speaking of Barry Cannon, so he has a question. He'd like to know if the participants think that concentrating on lobbying policymakers can detract from movement building. I think that's very interesting. Robbie, I see you nodding your head. What do you think?
Again, yes. Completely.
Okay.
Again, it's that fine line of, how can we work on the social movement and how do we keep those relationships with politicians as well? How do we do that fine line? I think it is. I think this professionalization of activism has gotten too much. I know we talk about tax being too complex or intellectual property being too complex, but when you bring it down to the values of it, it's like, do you think people should have access to the same medicines all around the world? That's literally just a question we need to ask people, and you can grow a movement from that. But we don't say it in simple terms. We make it complex because we're afraid of being told that we're the naive ones. We're like, we don't really know what we're talking about. So we try and be complex. Or a lot of it is the academics. We use too much academic jargon when actually we just need to be able to talk to the people. And I think that's the real fundamental thing. And that's why I always harp on about, why do I survive and all my friends die in Africa? When you put it in simple terms like that, people are like, why is that the case? Why are we pumping so much public money into, like our taxpayers' money into research developing these new drugs? And then one pharma company owns the whole intellectual property for 20 years. And they get to charge whatever they want. So I do think it's the voices that we need to, the voices of people to create that movement. However, I just think we need the movements to ask the right questions. So for example, now I'm not picking on one complete movement, I'm just talking about one that I understand, but with the cystic fibrosis or CANBI, they give out, why isn't the HSE paying for this drug? Why is it reimbursing the drug? They're not asking the question, why is the drug so expensive in the first place? So this is the question that they need to be asked, and then we need to give them solutions. Say, well, you need to issue a compulsory licensing, or we need to change or burn down the whole intellectual property regime because it's completely unfair. So I do think that we can use the voices of stories and then give the practical element too. I just think in a lot of the things, I can only talk about healthcare, can't talk about tax or environment, but how do we speak to the people in ways that they understand, but true to the complex issues as well? So again, in the access movement, we are really struggling with that. How can we do that properly? And what resources do we have to work with it all too? And how do we get the media on our side?
Well, that's literally, I was just going to ask, could I just jump in on that point? Because I think that's absolutely key. And I think the independence of the media and the extent to which it's beholden and compromised because of advertising revenues and paywalls and all of these different types of things is really, really problematic. Because I think Robbie made the point really powerfully earlier in terms of the danger of, lobbying behind closed doors and feeling that you've done something, and the need for activism. You need both, but what we really need is that broader accountability, education, awareness, and the facts, unbiased, probing, investigative journalism, really to the fore. And I have to say, that is a huge concern for me. I know we have some brilliant journalists here in Ireland, but I do think, we've become increasingly reliant on independent media outlets for consistently getting civil society's perspective out there and really sort of looking at the uglier side of things. There is an agenda there that is compromising media, unfortunately, in my view. And notwithstanding the extraordinary efforts of some amazing journalists. But I think that is a huge problem, and I think it's something that we have to rigorously defend and push back upon.
Absolutely. Now, a question directly for you, Tracta. So the government are likely to attempt to make out a list of amendments that are needed to push through the last 2% of CETA. How should we prepare?
Well, good luck with that, I'd say. In terms of the government, I personally don't believe that they can do this legislatively. I think it's much more complicated. But I think the fundamental issue in terms of preparing for CETA is to focus on the fact and the important role that our constitution has played in this, and to protect our constitution at all costs. Because our constitution has not just stopped the ratification in its tracks in Ireland, but it basically has stopped the ratification at EU level of all of the member states, because all of them need to sign up to it. And if you think about the EU as a trading bloc, that is a massive trading bloc. So that basically, if its model, including investor state dispute settlement mechanisms, is now stopped in its tracks, that potentially will have massive ripple effects in relation to the configuration of trade agreements, not just emanating from the EU, but across the globe. And that's going to be incredibly important, particularly for the developing world, and countries that will otherwise be, literally taken into the spider's web. So we have an incredible responsibility in Ireland to really watch really vigilantly over this, and to make sure that, because we are standing in the gap now, that we do not fall. We literally are standing between, the demise, basically, of investor state dispute settlement mechanisms. And there is a huge responsibility on our shoulders, because country after country, like Germany ratified the other day, there isn't a full appreciation of the significance of what's happened here. And so I think civil society needs to stay engaged on this. They need to not be complacent. And they need to be really rigorous in relation to prompting or taking advantage of this opportunity to sort of really question and to push back on, well, it's not just a case of just going ahead and actually changing a piece of legislation. Do we want this? Do we really want big corporate interests holding our government basically to ransom when they want to change progressive policy? We need to force the debate. We need to sort of say, we don't want this. Let's get real and force the debate back on the merits, rather than just the technicalities of the legislation.
Okay. And then a question from Lisa to Nessa. She wants you to talk a little bit more about tax havens and what can be done to stop them, if there's anything can be done.
Yeah, that's the big question. People get kind of hot under the collar when you talk about tax havens, because there isn't a common definition of what one is. There is an OECD definition of a tax haven, but it's so narrow that a lot of jurisdictions that are clearly facilitating tax avoidance don't fit the definition. So, my understanding of a tax haven is a jurisdiction that, actively facilitates corporate tax avoidance. And corporate tax avoidance happens in many different ways. There's lots of different channels that corporations can use to avoid tax. And over the last, let's say, 8-10 years, some of those structures have been closed down, like in Ireland, the infamous double Irish Dutch sandwich and the stateless structure that Apple used. Those have been outlawed in Ireland now. But, the interesting thing about that is that for a long time, the Irish state would say this is a problem of US tax law. And that is factually correct in that the United States could, in relation to its own, US corporations that are resident and or that originated in the United States does have the legal power to shut down a lot of this, but that is a problem of the political system in the United States, that there is a political struggle over how corporations should be taxed and how their foreign profits should be taxed or brought on shore. So a lot of the stuff that we've heard about in the newspapers has been, you know, closed down, some of it. But now we see, I suppose, at the moment, decisions in corporations about where to place their intellectual property. And some of them are reshoring it back to the US because there has been a change in tax rules there since Donald Trump. One of the things he did do, despite all the awful things that he did, is he did end the system of allowing corporations to defer their tax payments indefinitely. And the double Irish and the Apple statelessness structure showed corporations not paying much tax, but that's because they were legally allowed to defer their tax payments to the US, and they could hold that money nowhere, as in the case of Apple, or in Bermuda or in the Cayman Islands, which was kind of the end point of the double Irish tax avoidance structure. So there has been changes which has prompted some reshoring of assets and profits to the US. But Ireland has also been affected by those changes, where a lot of US companies have brought their intellectual. So that is resulting in, you know, it's hard to know what the surge in corporate tax receipts is, what's behind it in Ireland, but what it ultimately means is big corporations, very big corporations, are booking more profits in Ireland and therefore paying tax at a low rate, 12.5%, on those profits. And it's likely that they are putting more profits here because they have more substance, because they have their intellectual property here. So that seems to be the latest kind of development of the tax games. And it's astounding to me that after, you know, we're a good 4 years into the global reform process, and it's still possible for it to happen that multinational companies can place really hyper valuable intangible assets in a small country like Ireland when they weren't developed here. Now, we will see, will they keep them here? They may do. It's a big decision about where a corporation puts its most valuable things. So it may be that Ireland, you know, has simply profited from this. So, you know, the negotiations continue on the tax reforms. We'll see if the current agreements are implemented. We'll see what the responses of corporations will be, how they'll behave. And we'll also see what developing countries do. Will they stick with this agreement? Will they renege? Will they insist on the right to have unilateral taxes and to impose digital taxes, for example, excess profit taxes? I think that's still an open question.
So I hope we will see. That's the thing. So with that, thank you so much. It was a really wonderful discussion. And I just want to thank you again for a really, really fantastic evening. So with that, I'll hand over to Chris, who will close the evening. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Paul. And thanks to all three of our amazing speakers. That was really a masterclass. And I just thought all the interactions and the commonalities, which was, I suppose, when we were talking about this, you know, was what we were hoping to draw out of this conversation. I think they came across really forcefully, and the recording of this as well, I think, will be a great resource for those who weren't able to be live with us tonight. So thank you all again for such an enriching and a positive discussion, despite the dark material. You know, we're weaving something. Hello, someone popping into Nessa's screen there. But yeah, for all that dark material, I think we'll be using it to weave something quite light and hopeful. And just to finish up, for those who are able to stay on for a couple of extra minutes. We just wanted to, I suppose, do a little bit of a soft launch and just share with you the link to the report. So as I mentioned, for those who are here at the very start, you know, the impetus and the inspiration for this series came out of a piece of sort of engaged research that we conducted with Dr. Barry Cannon from the Department of Sociology at Maynooth University, and also participated then some other organizations and researchers from the sector, sort of examine you know, what's going on in the area of global solidarity and global citizenship. So we hear a lot of talk about these particular issues now from governments and others, and we wanted to interrogate that further. And the result is a report that hopefully Aga will be able to post. Yeah, thank you, Aga. There's a link to it just in the chat there that you can have a look at. Maybe I can just, no, I can't share my screen, but you'll be able to find the report there, which apart from anything else looks very attractive and very nice, and is a really a fantastic sort of bring together of the kind of theoretical side of things, a lot of academic thought in there to, I suppose, enrich and draw out these debates that are going on around what are we talking about when we're talking about democracy in a globalized world. How can we be in solidarity with other places in other parts of the world? You know, how can we act as global citizens? And I think, you know, the findings of that, from all that complexity and those very weighty questions, you know, Barry Cannon's managed to distill that into a really approachable, readable, and you know, incredibly short, given the complexity of everything that we're dealing with there. Piece of work that I would encourage everyone to read, and so we're very proud to do that, and the work with Barry. You know, some of the things that you know are coming through from that were very much in evidence in the conversation tonight and in the previous two sessions that we've done as part of this series. But I suppose particularly around the globalization piece, you know, how it's made the whole idea of state sovereignty much more complex. You know, so when we talk about democracy and we talk about citizenship, we're still within the sort of framework of the state, and yet then there are all these transnational issues and also transnational bodies and fora and powers, and yet, as we also heard then from various cases tonight, and we're coming back still to nation states a lot of the time, you know, with the challenge to CETA in the courts, or the idea of lobbying our politicians at the national level, or, you know, to use a Tracta's phrase, you know, their nations are still able to stand in the gap when it comes to even though these are big global issues, the nation state and that model of democracy is still very relevant. But then we also sort of explore the idea that there are these multiple sovereignties now in this kind of complex, globalized, interconnected world. So that's just one, and I think, you know, Robbie, you talked quite a bit about that. Well, everyone did, but you know, it came through very strongly with that idea of sort of these different levels in which we must be active, and ways of building and maintaining networks was being talked about as well. And so, you know, one of the things that came very clearly from the work with Barry was the idea of democracy as something that is made and remade through struggle, through popular struggle, and so this idea of being a global citizen then, likewise, you know, or global citizenship, like we've come to view that again as something that's dynamic, that's active, that occurs through action, and, you know, not just any action, but we were talking about acts of global citizenship, that they should be transgressive or questioning of models, disruptive, but they should also have a transformative dimension, a transversal orientation, and an international perspective. And I think all three of our speakers, brought all those elements in their activism and the work they're doing and into the discussions that we had. So I think I would very much encourage anyone here to download that report, to read it, and of course to get in touch with us, and we'll be reaching out to others via email as well. So once again, thank you to Barry Cannon for that excellent report. Thank you to Paul for your moderation, Robbie, Nessa, and Attractive for your wonderful contributions this evening, and hope to see you all again soon. Thank you.